It was September of 1967, in the far northern corner of South Vietnam, just below the strip of ground that separated the two Vietnams. There was a hill there, 158 meters of red clay, standing in the middle of a red mud plain, so low that a man walking toward it across the flat would not have called it a hill at all. The Marines called it Thien. The hill was just big enough to hold a reinforced battalion, and no bigger, and a reinforced battalion of United States Marines was living on it, underground, in holes roofed with sandbags and heavy timber. From the top of it, on a clear morning, a man could turn around and see the whole of the supply base the Marines had built behind him, laid out below like a drawing, which is why the hill was never going to be given up. In the last third of that month, more than 3,000 mortar rounds, artillery shells, and rockets came down on it. The guns firing them stood on the far side of a river no one on the ground was allowed to cross. This is the complete story of Thien, the year the hill was held, and what it took to hold it. Before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps. The Long Watch reach other people who fall asleep to the past. Videos like this one take weeks to research and build, and that one small click genuinely keeps the watch going. Now, get comfortable. Let's go back to the beginning, to the ground itself, in the far north of the country, in the dry season, before anyone had put a sandbag on it. The hill cannot be explained without the ground it stood on, and that ground begins at the sea. Northern Quang Tri was the top corner of South Vietnam, the last province before the line. Coming inland from the South China Sea, you crossed a belt of sand dunes, then low open paddy country webbed with rivers and canals, then rolling hills of brush and scrub timber, and finally the steep, jungled mountains that come down out of Laos and turn the weather around. The lower half of the province was farmed, with villages along the rivers. The upper half was mostly grassed. The soil of that upper country was red. The official history describes Thien in a single passing clause as a hill in the middle of a red mud plain, and that clause does more work than a photograph. The red is laterite, a clay of aluminium and iron oxides that goes to fine abrasive powder in dry weather and to heavy paste in wet. At the airfield at Dong Ha, it was not scenery but a maintenance problem. One general, remembering the transport squadrons of the summer of 1966, said that some 20-odd engines were completely chewed up by the laterite at Dong Ha. Growing out of that red ground was elephant grass, 7 feet of it, coarse and pale and stiff enough to stand on its own. A caption in the Marine Corps history says that moving through it in the zone could be nerve-wracking because it offered superb concealment to anyone lying in ambush. Where the grass thinned, there was brush, 4 to 12 feet high, thick enough to slow a rifle company to a walking pace. From the air, the plain looked soft, almost pastoral. On the ground, it was country you could not see across. The year there had 2 halves and no middle. From February through August, less than 4 inches of rain fell in a month, and by April the air went clear and the distances opened out. Then, in September, the sky closed, and it stayed closed until January. The line all this weather ran across had been drawn in the summer of 1954, in Geneva, at the end of the French War. Vietnam was partitioned at the 17th parallel, and an international commission of Canadians, Indians, and Poles was appointed to watch the truce. On the ground, the parallel was mostly water. The demarcation line followed the Ben Hai River as far as a hamlet called Bo Ho Su. and from there ran west as a straight ruled line to the place where Laos, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam come together. The demilitarized zone was a belt of ground running along the Ben Hai River, a few miles of it on either bank, dividing the two Vietnams. The northern half of that belt was ground American units on foot were not allowed to enter. They could fire back across the line, and artillery, naval guns, and aircraft were permitted against military targets on the far side. But nobody walked over. The southern half was South Vietnamese territory, and going into it on foot required an authorization that did not exist until the spring of 1967. That was the rule of the place. It was a rule both sides worked inside. Nothing on the ground marked it. An Air Force study of the region said as much in one dry sentence. The zone delineated no sharp geographical region the way the political separation did. The dunes ran on north of the river. The brush hills ran on north of the river. The same red plain lay on both banks, growing the same grass. A man standing in that grass could not have told which half he was in without a map. What changed at the water was not the country. It was whose country it was. Thien stood 2 miles south of the zone and 14 miles inland from the sea, on the northern lip of the Red Plain. It was 158 meters, a low hill by any standard, and the highest thing for miles. Everything around it lay lower. The plain running south, the grass running north toward the river, the tree lines out west where the ground climbed. From the top, a man had the best observation in the area. Dong Ha was 10 miles off. The headquarters of the 9th Marine stood on high ground there. In the Marine Corps, a regiment is called simply that, and the 9th Marines held this piece of the border. Because Hill and headquarters could see each other, line-of-sight radio worked perfectly, which mattered in a province where terrain ate signals. The regiment's commander explained the hill's value later without a tactical word in it. A man who had once seen what lay behind that hill understood instantly why the Marines had to hold it. If you had stood on that crest on a clear morning, the whole argument would have taken one turn of the head. Face north, and you were looking at the zone, the grass, the river nobody could cross, and the country beyond it. Face south, and you were looking at runways and fuel farms, ammunition stacked behind berms, hospital tents, and the road net that fed every position on the border. One low hill lay between the two views, and whoever stood on it had both. It was not alone out there. East of it, on the same shelf of ground below the zone, sat Gio Lin, another position with guns in it. South lay Cam Lo on its river, and past Cam Lo the base at Dong Ha, nerve center of the whole district. West of all that ran Route 9, the only east-west road in the northern corner of the country, paved in 1967 along its eastern part alone. Strung along it came Camp Carroll with the heavy artillery, then the rock piles standing over its valley. And at the end of the road, Khe Sanh, near the Laotian border. The hill had not been an American idea. When Marine companies first worked this ground, in September of 1966, there was already a South Vietnamese outpost on top of Thien, and the Marines operated around it rather than on it. Their first contact came a short way northeast of that outpost and lasted 3 hours. The next day, 2 more companies met a North Vietnamese company south of the zone, in ground that had been dug and waded in, firing positions and trench lines that ran back north into the demilitarized belt. Everyone had been on this hill before the Marines got to it. By the beginning of 1967, the maps carried 2 Marine strong points immediately below the zone. Jiolin to the east, Thien to the west. A strong point meant a position to be held rather than a place to patrol from. A hole in the ground with a permanent address. Neither of them had been chosen by anyone who had ever stood on them. That choice was being made in offices on the other side of the world, by men working from a map of Vietnam with a line drawn across the top of it. The line was an idea before it was a place. And the idea came from a room in Washington. In March of 1966, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff whether the movement of men and supplies out of the North could be stopped by building something across its path. What he had in mind was enormous, a conventional barrier of mines and wire, watched over by troops running from the South China Sea across the top of South Vietnam, through the Laotian Panhandle, all the way to Thailand. In April, the Secretary handed the technical half of the question to American scientists working under a private research organization, the Institute for Defense Analyses. 67 of them took it on. Physicists and engineers a very long way from the elephant grass asked whether a barrier across that country could be made to work. Their report came back at the end of August, and what it described was not wire and mines held by men. The barrier they proposed would not be occupied by ground troops at all. It came in two halves, an anti-personnel section along the southern edge of the demilitarized zone, running west into Laos, and an anti-vehicle section further out. Minefields would be sown at the key points and salted with acoustic and seismic sensors. Aircraft would fly above it around the clock, listening to the sensors and calling in strikes on whatever the signals described. On paper, it was a machine, and the ground itself was the moving part. Some of the pieces ordered for it were strange enough to name. Among them were button bomblets, very small mines not meant to injure anyone who stepped on them with a boot. Their whole purpose was to make a loud noise, so that an acoustic sensor nearby would hear it and know something had passed. An earlier version was to detect movement with buried tubes, on the principle of the rubber counters laid across a road to count cars. Later, the tubes gave way to sensors placed by hand, one at a time, by men on foot. The conclusions went out to the Pacific for comment. Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp had weighed the first sketch in the spring and sent back a list of loads, supply systems in South Vietnam and Thailand, the volume of construction, the troops needed before the building, during it and after. In the middle of September, he answered again. "A barrier system must be tended," he wrote. "If it is not, it can be breached with ease, while the flow of men and material continues. An obstacle delivered from the air would not take the place of soldiers on the ground, and the time, effort, and resources needed to establish a barrier on the ground would be tremendous." The Secretary went forward anyway. On the 15th of September, he set up a joint task force inside the Department of Defense under an Army officer, Lieutenant General Alfred Starbird, whose ordinary job was running the Defense Communications Agency, and told him to produce a system that would stop, or at least complicate, the movement of men and supplies from north to south. That directive is the moment the notion became a program, and the program was given a name, Practice 9. In Saigon, General Westmoreland had reservations of his own, but in October he told his staff to study what could be built along the zone. His planners came back with a different shape, a linear barrier through the coastal ground below the zone, a chain of fortified strong points running west from it to the Laotian border, and a mobile defense working behind all of it. On the 10th of October, he met the secretary in Vietnam and offered it instead of the Washington design. McNamara was flown over the zone on that visit, saw what the northwestern hills would do to a construction schedule, and let it be understood he was inclined to agree. Back in Washington, he sent the president a memorandum recommending a barrier at the 17th parallel. "It may not be fully effective at first," he wrote, "but I believe it can be made effective in time, and that even the threat of its becoming effective can substantially change the character of the war." In late November, Westmoreland's finished plan reached him. A linear obstacle of about 30 kilometers below the zone, from the sea to a point near Dong Ha Mountain. Wire, minefields, sensors, observation towers, a row of strong points, an armored unit behind it, and west of its end, some 20 separate barriers laid across the passes toward Laos. Drafting the Marine share fell to the 3rd Marine Division. General Walt, commanding the Marines in the north, had one instruction about the report. It was to open by stating that his command did not agree with the barrier idea and preferred the mobile defense it was already conducting. He sent the plan on with a covering letter saying it was submitted in response to a directive, and that in his opinion such a barrier was not going to be worth the time and effort put into it. The objection was not a Marine objection alone. The Joint Chiefs themselves, all of them but the chairman, put their disagreement in writing twice, in February and again in June. The Commandant of the Marine Corps would tell a Senate subcommittee that summer that from the very beginning he had been opposed to this project. Nor did the argument divide by service. Westmoreland had offered his version as the lesser of two designs, and Cushman, taking over in the north in June, thought a finished system would free his forces for other work. The planners themselves were uneasy about the word. The group that completed the requirement plan in January of 1967 wrote a caution into it. The term barrier should not be used because it suggests an impenetrable defense, and that was more than the system was intended to be. The caution went into the file half a year before the word reached the newspapers. The plan had 4 names in 9 months. It began as Practice 9. When the code word leaked, it became Illinois City for a few weeks, and then, from the 14th of July, Die Marker. On paper, it was the strong point obstacle system. The Marines building it called it the McNamara Line. Thien had its place in the arrangement before anyone on the hill was told. It stood at what would be the northwest corner of the system, the far end of the line, the last position before the ground went west into the hills, and the one nearest the zone. Whatever shape the design took, that corner was going to be there, and somebody was going to have to sit in it. None of the argument changed what had already started on the ground. Months before any of it was signed, in the first week of April, tractors began cutting into the brush between Jiolin and Thien, and publicly, the Marines called the work a modest effort to clear fields of fire and put in a limited obstacle system. Whatever the line was called in Washington, on the border it had become a strip of open red ground, and it was getting longer every week. Cutting it into the ground was a different kind of work from drawing it, and the ground was elephant grass standing 7 feet high in red clay. Nearly every photograph the division kept from that year shows the same object doing the same thing. A bulldozer with its blade up, pushing trees aside, and behind it a strip of bare earth running away toward the horizon. The Marines called the strip the trace, a cleared lane, wide open, where nothing was allowed to grow and nothing could cross unseen. On the 12th of April, the commander of the 3rd Marine Division, Major General Bruno Hochmuth put together a task force whose entire purpose was to cover one engineer company. Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Willis brought up the 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, and to it were added a platoon of tanks, a platoon of armored amphibian tractors, a platoon of Army self-propelled guns with twin 40mm cannon, and units of the South Vietnamese Army. All of that arranged itself around Company C of the 11th Engineer Battalion, which had been told to cut grass. The job was a strip 200 meters wide and 10,600 meters long, running from Gio Linh west to Thien. From the first day it went forward under artillery, mortars, mines, recoilless rifles, and small arms fire. None of it heavy enough on any given morning to stop the work, all of it steady enough to make the work take longer. About half the strip was open by the 19th of April. By the first days of May, the whole of it was cut. The men who worked it named it before the planners did. Brigadier General Michael Ryan, the Assistant Division Commander, came out to look at the job often enough that the lane between the two outposts became Ryan's road, and it became a road in the plain sense as well. Patrols used it. Small parties walked it from Thien down to the point where it met the road running south. A scar cut across the country to stop movement was, within weeks, the easiest place in the district to move. Around each outpost, the engineers cut a circle instead of a line. 500 meters of open ground in every direction from the wire. At Thien, that work began in the first week of May. The same tractors and the same blades turning in a ring around the hill instead of running straight across country. When it was done, a man standing at the wire in daylight could see every foot of ground for 500 meters out, and nothing standing on any of it but the tractors. 4 positions anchored the whole business, and on the map, they made a rough box. Thien at the northwest corner, Gio Linh to the east, Dong Ha at the southeast, Cam Lo at the southwest, 6 miles or so by 8. Who first drew the square and gave it the name, the histories do not say. On the engineering plans, the corners had duller labels. Thien was strong point of 4, and Gio Linh was a 2. Building, as opposed to clearing, came down to 3 verbs, and the official history sets them in a row. Filling sandbags, creosoting bunker timbers, installing wire. A bunker on these positions meant 5 feet of sandbags, loose dirt, and 12 by 12-inch timbers, laid over a hole in the ground, and every inch of that had to be carried, filled, soaked, and stacked by hand. There are photographs of South Vietnamese soldiers standing on a bunker roof at one of the base areas, shoveling a thick layer of dirt across the top of it. The heavy timbers had to be found somewhere first, and then hauled in over dirt roads. All of it happened in daylight and in the open because heavy equipment cannot be worked any other way. The officer who commanded the battalion on Thien that autumn wrote afterward about the engineer detachment attached to him, that it worked during daylight hours mostly, in the open with heavy equipment, and showed enormous courage, setting an example for all of us. He also recorded that the detachment lost a higher percentage of its men than his riflemen did. Casualties among the engineers mounted, the history says, as the other side used snipers, mines, mortars, and artillery to discourage them. One further thing stood in the path of the first clearing, and the history names it in a single line. A great many civilians lived on this ground, and every day of the work was watched from the north. From ground, the Marines could see plainly and were not going to walk on. In November, when the last stretch was being opened, Small enemy units were still working out of well-hidden bunkers along the route, ambushing patrols and interfering with the building. By July, the division could put a number on what the project had taken out of it. 15 tractors and 2 dump trucks had been destroyed outright. The 11th Engineer Battalion was giving half of everything it had to the barrier, and before the summer was out, the work was absorbing nearly a third of all the engineer effort in the entire force in Vietnam. The heavier cost was counted in battalions. In the middle of August, the force commander reported that 4 battalions plus their supporting units stood along the trace, and that they could not hold their front and at the same time build, man and operate a system in their own rear. By the end of that month, the arithmetic had grown. 9 Marine battalions, 7 of them searching, screening and covering the work. 2 of them and the engineers doing the building, all of them inside the range of the guns to the north. A regimental officer set down the consequence in one line. The extra task of helping with the trace meant no rest at all for the troops involved. The widening ran through June, and on the 1st of July it was finished. From Thien east through Khe Sanh to the tide line on the coast, 13.5 kilometers of it. The trace was now 600 meters wide, 10,000 man-hours, and something close to 5,000 hours of tractor time went into that widening alone. 600 meters is a distance at which, if you stood on one edge of it, the far edge stopped looking like a place and turned into a line. So the thing existed, not the mines and the sensors and the towers, which were still coming. The ground itself, stripped, red, and visible from every direction that mattered. Higher headquarters expected that a finished system would push the regiments moving south away to the west, into the hills, and make it harder to feed them. The history sets down what happened instead in a single sentence. The communists chose to attack before the system became too strong. By the time the last of the grass came down in front of Thien, they had already started. They had started well before the tractors. The fighting along this stretch of country came in a numbered series, and the numbers changed more often than the ground did. Prairie the 1st ended on the last day of January. Prairie the 2nd began the next morning, in the same ground with the same men, and ran until the 18th of March. Prairie the 3rd began the moment the 2nd ended and closed on the 19th of April, and Prairie the 4th opened the following day. The names moved. The ground did not. Through February, the North Vietnamese largely declined to fight on foot and did something quieter and more patient instead. Mortar and rocket fire on the outposts climbed week by week. On the 25th of February, the Marines asked for, and were given, permission to answer with artillery into the zone and past it, against purely military targets. 2 days later, heavy fire came down on Thien and on Khe Sanh, and on the 28th more than 400 rounds landed on the artillery position at Khe Sanh inside 17 minutes. On the morning of the 27th, a reconnaissance team northwest of Cam Lo had watched what appeared to be 2 soldiers walking and had gone out to take them. What it had found was a company, the leading element of the 812th Regiment of the North Vietnamese Army. By 11:45, the team reported at least 100 men around it. The nearest help was a rifle company, and it came slowly, because the scrub between them stood 12 feet high. Distance in that country was measured in hours. That company had believed, earlier the same morning, that it was leaving. Half its battalion was already aboard ship for Okinawa. Its commander, Captain Karl Bakowitz, had come to the operations bunker to ask whether there was any chance of being sent north of the Cam Lo River, and had been told there was none. He was visibly relieved and said so. Last night, he told the major, "I had a dream that if I went north of the Cam Lo I would die." His company marched most of that night and reached the surrounded team at 18 minutes before midnight. In the morning, moving up a hill, it was fired on from both flanks. He was among those killed. The shelling kept its own books, and the books rose. Across the northern provinces, the enemy's expenditure of artillery, mortar, and rocket ammunition came to 2,183 rounds in January, 2,656 in February, and 5,057 in March. Of the Marines lost in Prairie the 2nd, about a third of the dead and two-thirds of the wounded were hit by mortar fire. Whatever else this was becoming, by weight it was already an artillery war. For a fortnight after the 20th of March, both outposts were shelled almost every day, and attacks on them and on the men clearing the ground between them became an ordinary feature of the week. By the first days of May, the strip was cut, and the engineers were working on the ring of ground around the outpost itself. On the hill that week were a small command group of the 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, its reinforced companies A and D, and a unit of the Civilian Irregular Defense Group. Local men recruited and armed for the defense of their own district. Company D had taken over its share of the perimeter from a South Vietnamese unit only a few days before. And nobody outside the wire had been told. At 5 minutes to 3 in the morning on the 8th of May, a green flare rose into the sky south of the hill. The barrage came with it, 300 rounds of mortar and artillery onto Con Thien, and at the same moment fire onto Camp Carroll, onto Gio Lin, onto Dong Ha. Under cover of it, sappers worked up to the wire and blew a gap in it with Bangalore torpedoes, lengths of pipe packed with explosive. Pushed under an obstacle, small parties began coming through the gap. At about 4 o'clock, 2 battalions attacked through the breach. The weight of it came down on the right flank of Company D. And there the fighting closed to arm's length and stayed that way. An engineer platoon went in to reinforce the line. The same trade that had spent the spring filling sandbags, put in as infantry in the dark, on ground it had cleared itself. What the defenders ran short of first was light. The 81mm illumination rounds were spent, and the artillery at Gio Lin could not make up the difference, for a reason as flat as a line in a manual. Its heavy pieces were the 175mm guns, and for that gun no illuminating shell exists. So for a stretch of that night the fight went on by sound and by muzzle flash, until a flare aircraft came on station overhead, hung light above the hill, and held it there until the sky came up on its own. Company A sent a platoon across to Company D, and with it an ammunition column, an Army self-propelled gun, 2 armored amphibian tractors, 2 quarter-ton trucks. The gun took a rocket-propelled grenade, stopped and burned. A charge went off under the tractor behind it, and it burned as well, though the crew got clear. The third vehicle, swinging wide around the fires, wound barbed wire around its left rear sprocket and stuck there for the rest of the night. The platoon walked the rest of the way. By first light, Company D had stopped the penetration and closed the gap in the wire. By 9 in the morning, the men who had gotten inside the perimeter were dead or prisoners. 44 Marines were killed that night, and 110 were wounded. The Marines reported the other side's losses as 197 dead and 8 taken prisoner, with 72 weapons left on the ground. among them 3 flamethrowers, the first flamethrowers used against Marines in that war. There is a photograph of the battalion's executive officer, Major Edward Boyd, holding one of the 3 up for the camera, the way a man holds an unfamiliar tool. The units that came through the wire that night were never identified by name in the Marine record. The Marines counted 2 battalions. An Air Force summary of that spring credited 2 major attacks on Con Thien to elements of the North Vietnamese 812th Regiment. The same regiment a reconnaissance team had walked into northwest of Cam Lo in February. The attack had been carefully rehearsed. It had also gone in against the strongest point of the perimeter, and kept going in at that point after it was clear the resistance there was heavier than anyone had counted on. Whoever planned it had not known that 2 reinforced Marine companies were on the hill. The last of the ground they crossed, coming and going, was the belt the engineers had cleared the week before, open the whole way. The date was the 8th of May, 13 years to the day after a French garrison in the northwest had fallen. The official history records it in one line, at the head of its account, and does not come back to it. And on the same day as the attack, word came that changed one of the rules. Ground operations would now be allowed in the southern half of the zone. The country north of the trace, which had been something to look at, was about to become somewhere to walk. The wire at the top of the hill was back in place within days, and the next thing to change at Con Thien was not on the hill at all. It was a rule about the ground in front of it. The southern half of the zone was South Vietnamese ground. Until the 8th of May, no American ground unit had walked on it. Crossings from the north had become frequent enough by that spring for the rules of engagement to be rewritten, and from that day, the units along the demilitarized zone were allowed to go into that ground on foot. Assembling a force to do it took 10 days. A battalion came up from Phong Dien, and another from Phu Bai, and the last of the Pacific Reserve came from Okinawa, flown into Dong Ha directly in a lift of 42 Air Force and Marine aircraft. Moving that one battalion, 1,233 men, took exactly 31 hours. 3 days after they landed, the same battalion was put into helicopters and set down inside the demilitarized zone, near the south bank of the Ben Hai, as a blocking force. There were 4 operations and 4 names, because 4 different commands were involved. Hickory belonged to the 3rd Marine Division. Bow Charger and Belt Tight were the 2 special landing forces. The battalions kept afloat offshore with their own helicopter squadrons. Lam Son 54 was South Vietnamese. Lam Son was an old Vietnamese hero, and the 1st ARVN Division named all of its operations after him. At 5 in the morning on the 18th of May, 5 South Vietnamese battalions moved up Route 1 in column, reached the river without meeting anything at all, and turned south. The Marines went the other way. 2 battalions moved north out of the positions around Con Thien with tanks, into ground they had been looking at for months and had never walked, and found it defended from bunkers and trench lines that had been dug at leisure. The fighting went slowly, a hedgerow and a ridge at a time, and it went on for most of 10 days. At the top of the zone, the landings came in by helicopter. 15 aircraft lifted off the deck of the Okinawa, with 5 Marines in each, and flew in low and fast, under 50 feet and near 80 knots, because of the machine guns on the far bank. The planners had studied that zone only in aerial photographs. Flying over it beforehand would have given away the morning. There was almost nothing on the ground there to navigate by. When the first zone turned out to be held, the flights were switched to a second one, 800 meters south. Behind all of this, another part of the plan was being carried out, and the Marines were not the ones carrying it. The people living in the southern half of the zone were to be moved out of it, and the work was given to the Vietnamese National Police. They came with trucks. They used amphibious tractors where trucks could not go, and helicopters where nothing else could go at all. They took the people south and west to Cam Lo, 7 miles west of Dong Ha, where a resettlement site had just been built to receive them. The number of people is the one thing about them the record tried to keep, and it did not keep it well. The plan spoke of 12,000 people. The tally kept at the receiving site said 6,000 by the 23rd of May, and more than 11,000 by the end of the month. A later Marine Corps history put the figure at 13,000. Nobody counted them the same way twice. Earlier that year, the State Department had begun arranging with the South Vietnamese government to discuss the land purchases the line would require and the resettlement of the people who lived where it was going. That is the only line anywhere in the record about the land itself. One sentence, in the passive voice, about ground that had been farmed for a very long time. On the 23rd of May, the advance stopped for a day. A ceasefire had been declared across all of Vietnam for the birthday of the Buddha, and the fighting in the zone stopped with it one day in the middle of the first entry into that ground when nothing was fired because of the calendar. It was also the day the count at Cam Lo was taken. Heat decided a good deal of what could be done that fortnight. Hot air gives a helicopter less to lift, and the battalion working in the north of the zone kept opening bunkers full of supplies. More than 30 tons of rice in one stretch, and 10 tons of ammunition. Most of the rice could not be flown out. What could not be carried was destroyed where it lay. One village in that ground has a name. A rifle company came into Shanghai on the afternoon of the 24th of May and found 40 defensive bunkers built in it and around it. The fight did not end until 5 minutes before 10 on the night of the 25th, when the Marines finished going carefully through what was left of the place. That is the whole of what the record says about it. The rest of it is silent in a particular way. The record that survives names the landing zones Goose, Owl, Parrot, Mockingbird, and it names one village, Shanghai, because there was a fight there. It does not name the places the people came from. The landing zones were all named for birds, and they lasted a morning each. The places where people had lived went into the reports as the buffer zone, the construction zone, the area. Hickory ended at midnight on the 28th of May. Bow Charger had finished on the 26th. Lamson 54 on the 27th. Across the whole set of operations, the Marines lost 142 men killed and something close to 900 wounded. The other result went into the history in a single clause. The construction zone was virtually free of civilians. With the people gone, the supporting arms could be used across that ground without asking anything first. That had been written into the plan from the beginning in plain words, and it was one of the reasons the operation was run. What the record keeps of the people themselves is a number, a means of transport, and a place, 11,000 of them. Trucks, tracked carriers, and helicopters. A site outside Cam Lo, 7 miles from Dong Ha, built in a hurry. A year and a half later, there were still more than 10,000 people living there. The record does not keep their names, their ages, or the names of the villages they were taken from. And north of them, on the hill they had been moved away from, the summer was starting. On the hill itself, the summer began with water. It came up by helicopter in 5-gallon cans, And from the landing pad, 2 Marines would carry 1 can between them the way the people of that country carried loads, slung from a pole across their shoulders, down the slope to their squad. The heat during those months made water a precious commodity, and the same limit shaped everything else on Khe Thien. Hot air gives a helicopter less to lift, so whatever a man needed came up in small amounts and was carried the rest of the way by hand. The guns north of the river worked at a steady, unremarkable pace all that time. Through May and June, the hill took a few hundred rounds in all, 5 or 6 a day, taken across the whole 2 months. It was not a siege, it was a raid. Men learned to hear it the way you learn to hear a road outside a window. July and August together brought a little over 500. The work was sandbags, filling them, stacking them, laying them over roofs, brushing creosote onto bunker timbers so the wood would not rot in the ground, unrolling wire and pinning it down, digging and then digging the same hole deeper. A photograph from that season shows a Marine looking at a bunker built out of ammunition boxes, packed with dirt, which had come apart when a shell hit it. Men on that hill built with whatever arrived in quantity. And what arrived in quantity was ammunition, sandbags, and the crates. The ammunition came in. A battalion's day up there divided into 2 halves that had almost nothing to do with each other. One company worked on construction inside the perimeter. Company patrols went out to the north, east, and west of the hill, and platoon patrols went south. Toward the end of summer, the men working inside the wire were taking more than 100 rounds of incoming artillery and rockets, which made flak jackets a matter of strict discipline rather than personal judgment. Their battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Lee R. Bendel, described the result in one sentence: "The Marines much preferred to take their chances on patrol than be sandbag fillers and bunker construction experts, interrupted by incoming barrages. There is a particular quality to working on a position that cannot be hidden." The outline of Khe Thien had not changed in months. Every trench on it, every pad, every gun pit had been photographed and plotted from the north at leisure, and the official history states the consequence without dressing it up. The communists knew the exact locations of Marine forces and installations. Nothing on that hill could be moved to a place the other side had not already measured. A man could dig deeper. He could not dig somewhere else. Colonel George E. Giroux, who had the 9th Marines that summer, explained the shape of it plainly. The area of responsibility assigned to his regiment was so large that the regiment could not patrol any one sector on a continuing basis. A piece of ground would be swept for a few days, and then it would be another week or more before anybody went into it again. The North Vietnamese understood the limitation and moved back into an area as soon as a sweep ended. Part of the reason there were never enough men was that the ground was being built on. By that July, the direct labor spent on the strong point system came to 5,795 man-days. That figure covers construction only, not the unit standing around the men who did it. The plan issued in June set the 1st of November as the completion date for the first phase. And through that summer, the date was still thought to be a real one. A road in that country was opened before it was used, and opening it took 2 men and 2 tools. A photograph kept from that year shows both. Private first-class outlaw walking a mine detector slowly along the surface, and behind him, Private Dotson down on one knee, feeling out the shape of what it had found with the point of a bayonet. The Marine Corps history calls the procedure a routine of that war. It went at walking pace, It was done standing up in the open, and it was done again the next morning. Work of that kind leaves almost no mark in the record, listing what the landing force battalions had been given to do that season. The official history ends on 10 days of what it calls dull but necessary housekeeping chores. In the country below the hill, on the hill itself, that description covered most of the summer. A great deal of work, and almost nothing anyone would later set down as an event. The men themselves had run out of anywhere to go. In the middle of May, the last of the Pacific Reserve had come into Vietnam, and with it the rotation of battalions back to Okinawa came to an end. One of the generals who watched it happen called it a real loss to the Marine units fighting in Vietnam. After that, a battalion coming off the hill went to another job, and not to a rest. The landing force battalions show the same curve from another angle. 12 days a month in the field on average over the first 4 months of the year, 16.5 in May, and in June, a new high of 22 days for one and 24 for the other. One of them had gone ashore for the May operations and stayed out 23 days without a break, the longest ground deployment the Special Landing Force had made since it was created, and its rest aboard ship afterwards lasted a week. What it had been doing ashore for most of that time was guarding a road. The artillery positions above the Cam Lo Bridge, the bridge itself, and the convoys and engineers moving north. That road, Route 561, ran north from the Cam Lo Bridge, and everything on Con Thien came up it or came in by air. The operation running through the area in June produced only light contact. Abandoned positions, graves, caches, and the history sums the month up in 3 flat clauses. The enemy stayed away, the road remained open, and Con Thien retained the integrity of its defense. The other side spent the same weeks doing the same work. What patrols found in the ground around the hill were mutually supporting bunkers joined by tunnels and hidden inside hedgerows, mortars dug in below the level of the surrounding earth, and in one complex, a roof and walls made of steel. On the 29th of June, an agent report described a column of porters crossing the Ben Hai on foot with 500 rounds of Shuri rocket ammunition which were stacked 2 kilometers east of the crossing. The following day, the same source reported 1,000 mortar rounds moving down the coast. American intelligence put something like 35,000 North Vietnamese troops in the ground above the zone that summer. That figure was never a description of anyone attacking the hill. It was the force that would have had a road open into Quang Tri province if the hill were ever lost, and it is the reason a low piece of red ground with a battalion on it was worth what it was costing to hold. In the last days of June, the shelling from north of the river picked up sharply, and patrols began meeting North Vietnamese who were dug in near the hill rather than moving past it. The official history closes its account of that stretch with one sentence that anyone who filled a sandbag that year would have recognized. There was to be much hole digging and sandbag filling before the summer ended. North of the cleared strip, past the last of the engineers' work, the ground went back to being farmland. Running up through it was Route 561, an old cart road 8 to 10 feet wide, with hedgerows along both sides about waist high. It came up from Cam Lo and kept going north toward the river. There had been a marketplace on it once. On the 1st of July, 1967, 2 rifle companies walked out a mile east of Con Thien to work the ground on either side of it. The reason they were up there at all was arithmetic. Colonel George Giroux, who had taken over the 9th Marines less than a month before, explained it afterward. The ground the regiment answered for was so large that no part of it could be watched without a break. A sector would be swept for a few days, then left alone for a week or more, and the North Vietnamese came back as soon as the sweep left. To break the pattern, the companies were sent into a patch 1,200 yards east of the hill. They belonged to the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, whose commander, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Schenning, had taken it over on the 22nd of June, 10 days earlier. The rest of it stayed behind, Company D on the hill, Company C at Dong Ha. Waiting north of the road in prepared positions were 2 battalions of the North Vietnamese Army. At 8 in the morning on the 2nd of July, Company A and Company B started north. Company A moved on the left. Company B moved up the road itself. At 9 o'clock, its 2nd platoon reached the first objective, a small crossroads 1,200 meters beyond the strip, and found nothing. Then the 3rd platoon and the company command group came up the trail behind it, and sniper fire began. Captain Sterling Coates shifted them left to work against it, and as they pushed north, the fire thickened until the platoon could not move. He ordered 2nd platoon to swing right around the position and brought 1st platoon forward to cover the rear. 2nd platoon started, and the fire drove it back onto the road. It came from the front now and from both flanks, and then the North Vietnamese added mortars and artillery. Company A had troubles too. It set off 2 claymore mines early in the sweep, and by the time Captain Albert Slater turned east toward Company B, it could fight or move, but not both. The shelling cut Coates's command group off from 2nd platoon. The North Vietnamese used flamethrowers to set the hedgerows alight on both sides of it and worked their guns in close behind their infantry. When the fire shifted onto 2nd platoon, the company commander, his radio operator, 2 of his platoon commanders, and the artillery forward observer were killed. Command passed to Captain Warren Kennip, the forward air controller attached to the company, who lost radio contact with the platoons at once. Forward, 1st platoon was trying to reach the head of the company with North Vietnamese pressing both its flanks, and its commander, Staff Sergeant Leon Burns, began calling airstrikes down. "I asked for napalm as close as 50 yards from us," he said afterward. "Some of it came in only 20 yards away, but I'm not complaining." The strikes broke the attack, and Burns got across to what was left of 2nd platoon and put both into a circle. On the hill, the first sign was the crackle of small arms fire, carrying across the fields at 9:30. And then the radio report. The estimate of what Company B had run into grew from a platoon to a battalion, and at last to a formation of several battalions. Schenning alerted Company C at Dong Ha for helicopters, and, knowing it would not arrive soon, sent out what he had: 4 tanks and 1 platoon of Company D. 2 officers went with them: Captain Henry Radcliffe, the assistant operations officer, to take command of Company B if he could reach it, and 1st Lieutenant Gatlin Howell, the battalion intelligence officer, who had led the 3rd platoon of that company for 8 months and knew every path in the ground where it was pinned. The group ran the cleared strip to the crossroads without trouble. Turning north onto the road, it came under fire at once from the North Vietnamese who had been working around Company B's flank and had swung south across it. Gunships came in. The 4 tank guns went to work, and the position broke up. Behind them, Company C was starting to land. Artillery caught the leading elements as they came in and wounded 11 Marines. The tanks and the head of Company C kept north. Half a mile up the road they found 1st Platoon. Radcliffe told Burns he was taking command and asked where the rest of the company was. "Sir, this is the company," Burns said. "What's left of it?" They pushed on to the farthest point Company B had reached, put in a hasty defense around the tanks, and turned back. Artillery followed them the whole way, and 2 of the tanks went up on mines. At the landing zone, the shelling caught them again, and the platoon commander and platoon sergeant of Company D, who were running the defense there, both went down. In the confusion, nearly 50 men started south along the strip on their own, before anyone on the hill recognized them. Shining sent his executive officer, Major Darrell Danielson, out with a truck, a jeep, and an ambulance to bring them in. At 3 in the afternoon, Shining reported to Giroux that all his companies were in trouble, and he had nothing left to put in. Giroux ordered the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines up by helicopter. By 6 in the evening, 3 of its companies and its command group were north of the strip, and Major Willard Woodring had taken companies A and C under his control. In the last of the light, the combined force attacked the North Vietnamese left flank. The pressure was enough. The enemy broke contact and drew off north. The fire that went out over those hours was on a scale nobody had planned. In the first hours, Marine aircraft put down 90 tons of ordnance in 28 sorties. The artillery fired 453 missions. Destroyers off the coast added 142 5-inch rounds. What came the other way was heavier. Over that day, the North Vietnamese fired 1,065 artillery and mortar rounds into Gio Linh and Con Thien, and more than 700 of them came down on the 1st Battalion alone. Staff Sergeant Burns, who was given the Navy Cross for the 2nd of July, said afterward that 27 Marines of Company B walked out of it. The battalion's first count that day was 53 killed, 190 wounded, and 34 missing. When the recovery work finished on the 5th of July, the number of missing had fallen to 9, and the number of dead had risen to 84. Of the other side, the official history says only that the battalion established no accurate count of enemy killed. The operation had a name by then, Buffalo, and it ran another 12 days. On the 3rd, a battalion was taken off its ships offshore and flown straight into the fight. Woodring attacked southwest of the road on the 4th. The 5th passed in hot sun with almost no contact. On the 6th, he pushed Slater's company out to the north-northwest into positions that could not be seen, and that evening it caught a column of 400 North Vietnamese walking south across its front, still in march order. The last real fighting came on the 8th, southwest of the hill, and after that there were only mines and harassing fire. Buffalo was closed on the 14th of July. For the operation as a whole, the Marines reported about 1,300 North Vietnamese dead and 2 prisoners. Their own losses were 159 killed and 345 wounded. One line in that reckoning mattered more than the rest, and it had nothing to do with the road, or the hedgerows, or the battalions beyond the crossroads. Half of all the Marine casualties in Operation Buffalo were caused by enemy artillery. The thing that had done half of it was never in the fight at all. The Marine Corps history calls it the one ominous development that came with the Buffalo fighting: the accurate use of large-caliber, long-range North Vietnamese artillery. It had been arriving all through the year, a little at a time, and by the first week of July, there was no longer any way to think of it as anything else. The first signs had come in March. Camp Carroll took nearly 500 mortar and rocket rounds in a single morning. 2 weeks later, Lin was hit with about 600 rockets and shells, which the Army's own history of that year calls the first major use of conventional artillery against American positions in the war. Harassing fire came down on Lin nearly every day for a fortnight afterward, and then it moved on to other places. At the end of April, it was Lin again, something like 850 artillery rounds and 200 mortar rounds over 2 days, and more than 50 rockets into Dong Ha. The pattern held through the spring. A position would be worked over for a while, and then the fire would shift. Supply dumps, helicopter service pads, and medical facilities were all on the list. It was not only the trenches that were being shot at. By July, the calibers were plain enough. 130 millimeters and 152 field guns and gun howitzers, heavier than anything the Marines had faced along that stretch of ground before. The heaviest of them could reach Dong Ha, 10 miles behind the hill. Some of the guns stood inside the zone itself. The heaviest stood north of the river. That mattered because of where the line was drawn. Marines on foot could work in the southern half of the belt along the Ben Hai. The northern half, and everything beyond the river, was close to them. Artillery could fire there, naval gunfire could reach it, aircraft could be sent over it, but no rifle company was going to walk up to those guns and take them. Both sides had known that rule for a long time, and both sides worked inside it. The change in volume was easy to measure and hard to absorb. In February, fewer than 1,000 rounds of all kinds had come down on the forward Marine positions in the whole month. In July, more than 6,000 did. Qua Viet, Lin, Dong Ha, Con Thien, Cam Lo, Camp Carroll, the whole line of positions along the top of the province was inside somebody's range fan, and so were the airfields, the command post, and the roads behind them. Finding the guns was another matter. By July, intelligence officers had identified about 130 firing sites, a message that the 3rd MAF sent to the 7th Air Force that month described what was thought to be in them: dispersed, camouflaged, heavily overheaded bunkers, proof against anything short of heavy bombs with delayed fuses. The batteries moved between prepared positions, fired in daylight, and covered themselves again. The official history is direct about why this was so hard. Ground observation was limited because ground operations in the zone were prohibited. Aerial observation was contested by missiles and anti-aircraft fire. Intelligence and damage assessment stayed, in its words, skimpy at best, and the time it took to collect and collate what there was produced targets that were often too old to be worth shooting at. The other side had no such problem. The North Vietnamese knew exactly where the Marine units and installations were, and the fact that the Marines held the prominent ground made watching them simpler still. The missiles were new that year too. The first surface-to-air missiles in this part of the war went up in May, from positions north of the Ben Hai, and one of them brought down a Skyhawk. On the 6th of July, while another Skyhawk was working in front of a battalion northeast of Con Thien, 8 missiles came up from north of the river. One of them hit Major Ralph Brubaker of Squadron 5 MA311. He came down on the enemy side of the line, lightly hurt, spent the night there, and was picked up by an Air Force rescue helicopter the next morning. After that day, for more than 2 months, none were fired at all. The 7th of July was quiet by comparison. The fighting north of the cleared strip had died away, and the 2 battalions out there spent the day working out what had happened to the regiment they had been fighting. On the hill, the command post of the 1st Battalion, Ninth Marines was doing the ordinary work of a command post. The round that came into it was a 152 millimeter howitzer shell. It went through 5 feet of sandbags, loose dirt, and 12 by 12 timbers. 11 men in the bunker were killed, and 18 were wounded, among them the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Schenning, who had been wounded on Cape Gloucester and on Peleliu in the Second World War, and again in Korea. Only one of the 11 dead is named in the record. First Lieutenant Gatlin Howell, the battalion intelligence officer, had gone up Route 561 with the relief group 5 days earlier because he knew that ground better than anyone else available. He came back from that. He was killed inside his own perimeter, sitting still, by a gun nobody on the hill had seen. The same day at Dong Ha, a 130 millimeter round with a delayed fuse struck at the base of the north wall of the 9th Marines command post and burst 6 feet below the floor of the bunker. Nobody was hurt. A little later, another round came into the chapel at Dong Ha during a Catholic service, and the chaplain's assistant was killed. Colonel Giroux moved his command post out of Dong Ha to a place northeast of Cam Lo, and there, in the official phrasing, relative quiet prevailed for the rest of the operation. The frequency and accuracy of the fire was the reason given at the time. There were others. Room was needed at Dong Ha for a forward division headquarters that was standing up, and the regimental staff knew something about the building they had been living in. The old French barracks that housed the headquarters were a prominent feature on the maps the North Vietnamese were using. A structure put up long before this war had become a mark to aim at, so the summer settled into a shape with no obvious end. The one complete answer, going up and taking the guns, lay on the far side of a rule that neither army was going to break. Everything else came down to knowing where they stood, and that was the part nobody could solve. The hill stayed where it was, watched from ground no one could walk to. The guns stayed where they were, out of reach. Nobody could walk to those guns. Whatever was going to be done about them had to be done from a distance, by men reading figures off a chart and passing them to other men standing beside a breach. And at that distance, the only tool anyone had was arithmetic. You worked out where a gun probably was. You worked out how much metal it would take to reach that particular square of ground. Then you sent the metal and waited for a photograph to tell you whether the square had changed. The work went on all year, in daylight and in the dark. Most of it belonged to the 12th Marines, the artillery regiment of the 3rd Marine Division, commanded by Colonel Edwin Schick. It had grown through the year the way everything along the zone had grown. By November, it held 5 Marine artillery battalions, 3 Army artillery battalions, and 2 separate Marine batteries. 220 guns under one regimental headquarters, the largest artillery regiment in the history of the Marine Corps. Among them stood the long Army pieces, the self-propelled 175s of the 2nd Battalion, 94th Artillery, which could throw a shell 32,700 meters. Some of the batteries acquired reputations the way ball players do. Battery A of the 1st Battalion, 40th Artillery, brought up self-propelled howitzers that could swing their tubes all the way around without shifting position, and answered so quickly and so steadily that the Marines of the division took to calling it automatic alpha. When infantry worked out beyond the wire, the fires along their route were plotted before they stepped off, so that the only thing left when a call came was permission to shoot. The gunners had a name for that too. They called it almost instantaneous artillery. Behind every one of those guns sat a room with a plotting board in it. In the fire direction center, a call came in, and the crew began computing before the full data arrived. And the same problem was worked twice, once in the battery and once at battalion, because a decimal in the wrong place lands somewhere. In July of that year, a machine arrived to do it faster. The first field artillery digital computer any of them had seen. Colonel Schick preferred his men, a well-trained and disciplined fire direction team. He said, would beat the machine for speed, for reliability, for working in any weather, and would not break down. The 11th Marines kept computing by hand and used the machine only as a check. The men computing by hand often found themselves waiting for it anyway. The generators it ran on were not reliable either. None of that was the hard part. The hard part was knowing where to aim. The division put in new counter-battery radars and sound flash ranging sets at key points along the zone, and an Army target acquisition battery worked at nothing but improving the quality of the information. At the end of September, a fire support information center opened with data processing equipment, so that everything the division, the Marine Force, and the 7th Air Force knew about a target could be brought into one place. And still, the photographs did most of the work. Aerial film became the backbone of the whole business of producing targets. The guns themselves stayed out of the frame. Many of them stood at the mouths of caves at the foot of steep hills north of the river, and after a few rounds the crew simply drew the piece back inside. A 1,000-pound bomb into a cave mouth settled nothing you could put in a report. Rockets could be launched by remote firing while the men who set them lay in deep bunkers a distance away. A mortar crew could drop several rounds down a tube in under a minute and be walking away before the answering fire found the ground it had come from. Camouflage, dispersal, prepared alternate positions, and the discipline to move. That was the whole of it. Out east, past the last of the land, the ships took their share. The destroyers of the 7th Fleet worked with 5-inch guns. The heavy cruisers answered with 8. In the spring, the fire support for one operation on the zone had come from 2 cruisers and 7 destroyers, 6 of them American and 1 Australian, standing off a coast the men in the trenches could not see. A ship has an advantage no battery ashore has. When the shooting is finished, it moves, and there is nothing left on the map where it was. From August, the B-52s of Strategic Air Command were brought into the work against the artillery across the river. That made the sky above northern Quang Tri a crowded place, and the crowding had to be managed by radio. A battalion or regiment would pass word up to the Division Coordination Center, and from there it went out to every pilot in the area, where the target lay, where the firing battery stood, when it would fire, and how high the shells would ride at the top of their arc. After that, staying out of the way was the pilot's own business. The system was not perfect, and it very nearly worked. The operations that pulled all of it together had plain, forgettable names: rope yarn, head shed, neutralize, eradicate, and one acronym that outlived them: SLAM. Seek, locate, annihilate, monitor. The idea was to use everything at once against a single set of coordinates, rather than one arm at a time. Heavy bombers, tactical aircraft, artillery ashore, guns at sea. The artillery and the ships went first, and the aircraft came in afterward, over the same ground, for whatever the first bombardment had left. Neutralize began on the 12th of September and ran to the end of October, and it was launched by the 7th Air Force, not the Marines, over country where the airmen and not the ground commander decided what was struck. The size of the answer over that stretch of September can be given in 3 figures, and they belong to 3 different services. The artillery of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force fired 12,577 rounds at known and suspected enemy positions in the region. Ships of the 7th Fleet fired 6,148 into the same area. Marine and Air Force pilots together flew more than 5,200 close air support sorties. The B-52s dropped tons of ordnance on the zone and north of it, and nobody set down the figure. What the heavy bombers actually accomplished was harder to write down than what they carried. The reporting on those strikes was thin all year. In a great many cases, the only thing anyone could measure afterward was the number of craters visible on a photograph. That is the arithmetic in its purest form. The thing you can count is the holes. There is one line in the record that holds the whole year. Across 1967, the guns on the far side of the Ben Hai fired 42,190 rounds. The artillery of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, Marine batteries, and the Army battalions attached to them fired 281,110. And by the end of that year, all of the work, the radars, the film, the ships, the bombers, the regiment of 220 guns had destroyed fewer than 40 North Vietnamese guns. None of that arithmetic was done on the hill. On the hill, the same month was counted another way. Not in rounds sent out, but in mornings. One morning that September, the assistant commander of the 3rd Marine Division was on the pad at Dong Ha in a light helicopter, waiting to lift, when the shelling came down on the base. The pilot picked the machine up and turned south, straight out through the falling rounds. They felt the aircraft shudder and knew they had been hit. Brigadier General Louis Metzger wrote afterward that they made a futile attempt to spot the enemy firing batteries, and then went on to Camp Evans and walked around the aircraft. There was a hole about 15 inches across in the tail. Even from directly above the barrage, you could not see where it was coming from. The month had begun on the ground, in the ordinary way. On the 4th of September, a company of the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, ran into an enemy force a mile or so south of the hill, and spent the afternoon working around its flank with tanks. Coming back onto the perimeters that evening, the battalion was mortared and shelled. 3 days later, another company fought 5 hours in the same country, with tanks alongside the infantry this time. Around the 10th, in the early evening, the 3rd Battalion 26 Marines met what looked like an entire North Vietnamese regiment 4 miles southwest of the hill and fought it for 4 hours. The battalion lost 34 men killed, and a day later it went south to be brought back to strength. Lieutenant Colonel James Hammond's 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines came up from Camp Evans in its place. Then, at 25 minutes past 3 on the morning of the 13th, a North Vietnamese company came at the north-northeast sector of the strong point itself, with artillery and mortars and heavy machine guns behind it. It did not get through the wire. When the supporting arms came in, the attack drew off, and the sector went back to being a sector. Later that same day, Colonel Richard Smith took command of the 9th Marines from Colonel George Giroux. Smith read the previous night as the edge of something larger, and moved to be ready for it. He put 2 battalions on ground behind the hill, where they could react if the enemy came in strength. The 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel John Peeler, to the southeast, and Hammond's 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines to the southwest, a third, the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines under Major Gorton Cook. he ordered inside the main perimeter. The hill itself was held by a battalion of the 9th Marines. Which one, in those days? The record does not say. The assault they had arranged themselves against never came. What came instead was fire on all 3 battalions for the next 7 days. Not fire covering an assault, but fire instead of one, the shelling of a position by an enemy with no present intention of walking onto it. In the last third of September, the Marine Corps history puts it at 9 days, from the 19th to the 27th. More than 3,000 mortar rounds, artillery shells, and rockets came down on the position. Across the month as a whole, the defenders could expect at least 200 rounds on almost any given day, which is a figure the mind does something strange with. 200 is a great many if you count them one at a time, and it is a routine if you have to live inside it. On the 25th, the count passed 1,200. The following day, it went back down to something like 200, and the day after that was another day. Outside the wire, Hammond's battalion lived the same month without the benefit of anything already built. They had come north in a hurry, and they never settled. Their commander described it plainly enough afterward. They became the roving battalion outside Thien, and the battalion moved every day and was shelled as much as the hill, sometimes more, and the difference was that they had to dig new holes in every position. That is the shape of those weeks in one sentence. New ground each afternoon, the same work each afternoon, the same amount of steel each night. On the 21st, they went out on a search 1,800 meters east of the hill. 2 companies on line, moving carefully. The ground there is terraced and cut up by hedgerows, and keeping a line across it proved almost impossible. The command group and the trailing companies kept halting to let the tail close up. And in the undergrowth, the leading elements lost sight of one another. At 10 minutes to 8, a company took sniper fire, then automatic fire from the front and the left, and then mortars. The Marines were close enough to the enemy mortar position to hear the commands being shouted to the crew. Too close to call artillery, and too pinned for the other company to help. The company backed slowly to ground with better cover and set up a landing zone. Hammond sent a 3rd company wide around the left, across 150 meters of open field. It got within 30 meters and came back under fire, covered by the other 2. The battalion wanted tanks, and after 96 hours of rain, there was no ground a tank could cross. At dusk, the shooting stopped on its own, and the companies walked back to the battalion perimeter. Nothing on any map was different that evening from what it had been that morning, and the thing that had decided it was the weather. If you came up to the hill in those days, you came by helicopter, and you did not stand on the pad while you waited. The landing zone was churned red mud, and there was a trench beside it where Marines and the occasional visitor sat until the aircraft was actually on the deck. The die marker bunkers that had gone up through the summer were finished by then, and the history says only that they provided some cover. A careful phrase, and the right one. Route 561 up from Cam Low had gone to slurry in the rain, and would take no vehicle at all. So everything that reached the position and everyone who left it went by air. The air itself was working short. At the end of August, one type of transport helicopter came apart in flight, and another of the same type failed on the ground the next day. The whole type was restricted overnight to emergency use. The 1st Marine Aircraft Wing lost half its helicopter lift in a matter of hours, and the replacements were still on ships bound from the American West Coast. What was left flew the schedule anyway. The squadrons kept a standby section on the strip through daylight, one transport and one armed helicopter to fly chase for whatever the day's plan had not covered, and a machine going into a zone where the shooting was still going on rarely came out without holes. Toward the end of the month, the shelling fell away. The Marine account credits the weight of the American reply. The Air Force study credited the reply together with the arrival of the rains. The Army history notes that 3 North Vietnamese regiments simply went back north across the river, perhaps to wait out the wet season. All 3 explanations are in the record, and none of them cancels the others. On the hill it registered as a change in the sound of the day, and then in the sound of the week. Nobody up there knew which of the 3 had done it, and the men filling sandbags in the drizzle had no reason to care. It had been loud, and then it was less loud. What was still coming and had been coming quietly all month was the water. The guns thinned out at the end of September, and what came in their place was water. On that coast, the wet season runs from September into January, and of the 100 inches of rain that fall on the demilitarized zone in a year, 80 fall in those months. Through the autumn it arrives in the lowlands as thunderstorms, heavy and sudden and warm, and only later in the winter does it settle into steady rain and drizzle under low cloud and fog. Nobody on the hill made a note of the day the monsoon began. It simply stopped being a season that was coming. The first thing the water took was the road. Route 561 ran from Cam Lo north to Thien, and by the end of the month, it had been turned into a bog that no vehicle of any kind could cross. Streams came up over their banks and stayed up. Water got in under the sandbags and washed bunkers and trench lines out of the ground, and a good part of the country along the cleared strip went from firm red earth to swamp. The rain did to the barrier in 3 weeks what the guns across the river had not managed all summer. While the heavy helicopters carried onto the hill what they could carry, the 11th Engineer Battalion was handed the road as its first job. The problem was not the other side of the river. The problem was crushed rock. Nothing would hold under a loaded truck without a bed of it, and the nearest quarry was at Camp Carroll, more than 15 miles away by dump truck, over roads that were coming apart in the same rain. Out of that work came a bridge, put in just north of the strong point called C2, down the road from the hill, and with the bridge, the road opened again. The division then did something that says more about the road than any description of it could. It put an entire infantry battalion on that bridge and left it there. If the bridge went, the only road into Thien went with it. The battalion was the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. It had come north from Camp Evans on the 11th of September and had spent the month since working the ground around the hill, rather than standing on it. By the time it took over the bridge, a month after it came north, the battalion had gone from a foxhole strength of 952 men to about 460. Foxhole strength is not the number on the roster. It is the number of men actually in the holes. The garrison up on Thien was a separate matter and a separate battalion. The position at the bridge was divided by the ground itself. The road ran north and south. A stream ran east and west, and the 4 rifle companies took a quadrant each. G Company in the northwest, H Company across the stream on the same side of the road, F Company northeast, E Company southeast. The command group dug in near the stream inside G Company's ground, close to the middle of it all. At 25 minutes past 1 in the morning on the 14th of October, artillery, Rockets and something over 100 mortar rounds came down on H Company, and behind the shelling the infantry came in. The fighting moved from one company's ground to the next as the mortars shifted, and it went on in the dark for 3 hours, in rain, on a position that had been dug 4 days earlier. The commander of G Company was killed, and his forward observer, and 3 of his platoon commanders, 2 of whom had arrived in Vietnam that morning. Lieutenant Colonel Hammond moved what was left of his command group across and put a 4th company out onto the open flank. By 4:30, the attack was pulling back. 21 Marines had been killed, 5 of them officers, and 23 wounded. In the afternoon, Lieutenant General Cushman, who commanded the Marine force in the north, and Major General Hochmuth, who had the division, came out to the bridge, and at the battalion commander's request the crossing was given a name, Bastard's Bridge, for the 21. At 2 o'clock the battalion handed it over to the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, and went down to Dong Ha into regimental reserve. After 42 days of close combat, around the hill itself the work went on in the wet. Patrols went out and came back, and what they kept finding were bunker and trench complexes, most of them about 1,500 meters out from the main perimeter. They destroyed what they found. The official history puts what happened next in one flat line. The Marines destroyed the bunkers, but often during subsequent patrols, they found them rebuilt again. By the first days of October, the bunkers were still there to be found, and now they were usually empty. The road was finished before the month was out. When the first vehicles made it through to Thien, the engineer battalion commander remembered afterward. General Hochmuth told him he was elated to get them off his back, and went to congratulate the men who had done most of the digging. That was the shape of the month's best news. A loaded truck arriving where it was supposed to arrive. By the middle of October, the guns across the river had gone quiet, and nothing was being built. The rain had stopped both. The strong points stood where they stood, half finished, with water running through them, and for several weeks, the loudest thing in that country was the weather. On the 7th of November, a photographer caught the division commander sitting in a light helicopter on the pad, with a rain suit pulled on over his uniform, waiting to lift off for an ordinary flight around the division's ground. He was 56 years old, a tall Texan, and he had had the division since March. On the 14th of November, the helicopter carrying the division commander exploded and went down in a flooded paddy 5 miles northwest of Hue. 6 men died. The colonel commanding the 4th Marines at Phu Bai heard of it in the early afternoon, and because there happened to be a helicopter on the pad outside his headquarters, he was among the first to reach the place. The aircraft upside down in a paddy, filled to the brim by rain that had been falling for weeks. 3 Marines went into the water, and a Vietnamese farmer whose name nobody wrote down went in with them. The records say what happened and do not say why. By the end of September, the hill had become a name that people at home recognized. What the name meant depended entirely on where you were standing when you heard it. Start with the word. The official Marine Corps history of 1967 never calls what happened at Khe Sanh a siege. It calls it a massive attack by fire, which is a phrase written by someone whose job was counting rounds. The volume covering the following year is looser. The North Vietnamese artillery, it says, in effect, laid siege to the Marines at Khe Sanh. An Air Force report on the same event states plainly that the siege of Khe Sanh was over. 1 stretch of days, 3 descriptions, all of them official. Even the length of it was reported differently. The headquarters in Saigon spoke of a month. The marine histories count 9 days, or 10, depending on which volume is open on the table. None of them is lying. They are different instruments, reading the same weather from different distances. And that distance is the whole of this. The clearest thing anyone in uniform ever wrote about the printed version came later, and it came from the Corps' own historians. The hill they wrote was represented in the press as a beleaguered fortress, a little Dien Bien Phu. Then, inside the same sentence, they set it straight, a hill scraped bare down to the raw red laterite, never occupied by much more than a battalion, with most of the fighting actually taking place some distance away from it. That is the only place in our record where the comparison is attached to this hill, and it is there in order to be corrected. The comparison itself was made about other places and by other people. The official histories use it seriously about the base at Khe Sanh, away west in the mountains. For Thien it lived in print, and print is where it stayed. On the 23rd of September, with the shelling at its heaviest, the assistant division commander spoke to reporters. Brigadier General Louis Metzger did not round anything off. The North Vietnamese, he said, were there in strength, and American firepower was not going to drive them away. If they did assault Thien, he added, they would pay a high price. That is a man describing what he can see from where he is standing. 11 days later, on the 4th of October, the headquarters in Saigon announced that American firepower, including a monumental effort by the B-52s, had broken the back of the month-long siege of Thien, and that the enemy was in retreat. General Westmoreland added that the enemy had suffered a crushing defeat. Those were the words that went out on the wire that day, from the level where the whole war was being added up. The same official anthology that recorded the announcement had already offered another reading of the same quiet, a page earlier and in a much smaller voice. Perhaps the enemy was only emptying his magazines before withdrawing, because after that day of heavy fire the pressure against Thien subsided. Two explanations of one silence, printed inside the same book, neither of them contradicting the other, and only one of them read aloud in Saigon. And a week before Saigon spoke, on the 28th of September, the New York Times ran a story about the fighting along the zone that was not about the hill at all. It reported that about 2/5 of the Marine helicopters carrying food and water and ammunition to the outposts along the demilitarized zone had been grounded because their tail assemblies were coming apart. That was the news from the northern provinces that week, printed while the shells were still landing. The official answer to that story is arithmetic, and it sits in the histories. 8 accidents involving that type of helicopter in Southeast Asia, 4 more in the United States, and a modification program that began in October and was finished by December. On the hill, the same fact arrived in a different form entirely. There was the helicopter that came, and there was the helicopter that did not come. And 2/5 of a fleet is a number that only exists at the level where fleets are counted. There is one photograph in the official history in which the two worlds are standing in the same hole. It was taken on the 2nd of October at the landing zone on Thien. Marines and journalists together in the trench beside the pad, waiting for the helicopter that would take them down to Dong Ha. Nobody steps out onto open ground until the machine is actually down. In the picture, everybody in the trench is keeping that rule, and no one in it looks like a visitor. The distance ran the other way as well. That autumn, the Commandant of the Marine Corps spoke publicly, more than once, about what the war in the northern provinces was going to require, and the official history notes, without any comment attached, that his statements received little attention. Some things were larger in print than they were on the ground. Some things were a great deal smaller. What was selected, in either direction, was not selected on the hill, and some of it never reached the page at any size. In December, a marine photographer took a picture of an engineer bulldozer at Thien, pushing the monsoon mud into piles inside the base, so that men could walk from one part of it to another. There is no headline anywhere in that. It is simply what the place was on the day someone happened to raise a camera. Both versions of the hill were made out of the same material. The beleaguered fortress was built out of real shells and real men, described from the other side of the world by people working to a deadline. The low bare rise with a battalion on it, and the mud and the bulldozer, was what stood at the end of the road. The two descriptions never had to meet, and in 1967 they did not. What is not in any of it on either side of the ocean is the thing the hill had been put on the map to hold. Out beyond the wire, in the rain, the line the hill had been placed to anchor stood half-built and stopped, and what was going to become of it was being settled somewhere else entirely. On the ground it looked like work. Bulldozers of the 11th Engineer Battalion at the edge of the cleared earth, dump trucks in low gear, working parties from the rifle companies filling sandbags between patrols. From the air, the positions had begun to take on shapes. One of the division's generals noticed that a strong point out toward the coast had come out triangular, and that another resembled an 8-sided French fort. While the hill was being described at home, the line it anchored was being argued over in message traffic that never left the command. In July, the Marine Command counted what the work had cost the men doing it, and set the figure down in the same flat register as everything else in the report. 4 killed and 77 wounded building. The additional men never came. The visits did. Engineer officers from the project staff came up to the sites more than once and had something to say about everything, from the size of the bunkers to their color, and one of them proposed painting them white, as he said had been done at Long Bin. The officer who listened to that, Lieutenant Colonel Willard Christopher of the 11th Engineers, decided afterward that quality control came down to cosmetics. The last month of the year was settled by weather. Silting closed the landing ramp at Ton Mai on the 10th of December, and the ramp at Khe Viet was shut from the 7th until the 29th for the same reason. Wind limited or canceled the transport flights on 23 of that month's 31 days. The staff was in place by then, and the priority. What was short that December was arrival. What the plan had asked for and never got was people. Early in August, the command reported to the Commandant of the Marine Corps that the original concept had required a minimum of 7,691 additional men, and that none of them had come. On the 16th of August, the general commanding the Marine Force in Vietnam wrote to Saigon that 7 battalions in the north could not do their job forward, and at the same time build, man, operate, and defend a system of strong points and obstacles in their own rear. The assistant division commander put it more plainly years afterward, going over the draft of the official history. The Marines required to do the construction work were exhausted from protracted combat, and the so-called security missions were in fact heavy combat. On the 3rd of September, a shelling of Dong Ha destroyed the ammunition supply point and the fuel farm there. The commanding general reported that it had directly affected his ability to go on with the project, and it had. Every board and every gallon of diesel that reached the cleared ground came up through Dong Ha first. 4 days later, Saigon put 2 questions to the Marine Command: what it would cost in casualties to put the obstacles in along the whole length of the cleared ground, and what the alternative was that continuous line were given up. The staff came back with an estimate: 29 days of work, 672 Americans killed, and 3,788 wounded. That was a forecast, not a record. The obstacles were never emplaced, and that bill never came. On the 13th of September, the alternative was approved. The obstacles would wait until the strong points and base areas behind them were finished, and the situation had steadied. One base area moved south, nearer Cam Lo. The 2 westernmost strong points, a 5 and a 6, came off the map. What had been drawn as one continuous line became a row of separate places. The pressure came back the other way in the autumn. On the 22nd of October, Saigon told the Marine Command that quality control was unsatisfactory and that the project had not been given the priority its operational importance deserved. Die Marker, the message said, was an operational necessity second only to combat emergency. At the end of the month, the project got a permanent staff of its own, with the deputy commander of the Marine Force in Vietnam, Major General Raymond Murray, put at the head of it. Murray was one of the most decorated Marines of 2 earlier wars, and most of what he found waiting for him was weather. A large part of the material bought for the project had drifted off to other commands for their own purposes. Much of the original bunker timber had arrived green and unseasoned and had begun to rot in the permanent damp of the monsoon, and so had enormous quantities of sandbags, which came apart faster than they were replaced. He went to Washington and came back with promises of new timber, and the rot went on regardless. He also discovered he could not make anybody do anything. His staff sat apart from the main headquarters, and he said afterward that it was never in a position to order anyone to do anything about the project. In the first days of December, the ground for Strong Point A3 had to be taken and held before anything could be built there. How in the hell, he said, were you going to build this thing when you had to fight people off while you were building it? In December, the commander in Vietnam came up to the zone twice and was not satisfied with what he saw at Thien. The bunkers had been built for an American battalion, and in the spring, the position was to go to a South Vietnamese one, half the size. The argument that December was about the thickness of a roof, whether the layer on top of it had to set off a mortar round or a 105mm shell. What actually stood at the end of the year could be counted. 167 bunkers finished, and 234 more complete, except for their roofs. Better than 67,000 meters of tactical wire laid, and 120,000 meters of minefield. By the end of the year, most of the positions were standing and none of them were finished. The whole undertaking, the construction, and the screening that made construction possible, the patrols and covering positions that let a bulldozer work, had taken 757,520 man-days. By the 31st of December, along with $1,622,000 worth of equipment lost to enemy fire. The history that prints those figures puts a line underneath them. They do not count the lives lost or the men wounded trying to build it. There was no day on which the barrier was canceled. There was a day in January when the 2 commanders agreed to suspend the obstacle line until the situation cleared. and the situation did not clear. Work on bunkers and wire ran on to the end of that month, and then tactical requirements took priority. The general who had signed the suspension said later that he had simply quit building what he called the fence, and that Tet came along and people had something else to think about. The line had one more piece of work left in it. In the summer of 1968, engineers were still busy at A2, at A3, and at Thien on positions of the unfinished McNamara line. And that work was a feint. It was there to be watched, to hold the attention of the observers across the river, while forward artillery positions went in somewhere else for an operation that opened on the 1st of July. Everything the line had been meant to do, it had been meant to do by standing in the way. The last thing it was asked to do was to be seen. The paper is organized by operation, not by place. Prairie and its three sequels, Hickory, Cimarron, Buffalo, Kingfisher, Kentucky, each one has a name, a starting date, a closing date, and 2 columns of figures at the bottom of the last page. Every one of them covers ground around Thien. Not one of them covers Thien. There is no line in the record that says what Thien cost. The operations that covered it overlapped, and their areas were larger than the hill. Kingfisher is the one that runs through the worst of it, from the middle of July to the last day of October, across the country north and west of Dong Ha, with the hill sitting inside it like a stone in a field. Kingfisher cost 340 Marines killed. The number of wounded is printed twice in the official record, and the 2 figures do not agree. One volume gives one number, another gives a number more than twice as large, and neither of them explains the other. On the 1st of November, Kingfisher closed, and the eastern half of the same ground, Dong Ha, Gio Lin, Con Thien, Cam Lo, became Kentucky, which ran on for another 16 months. The official history is unusually direct about what the change of name accomplished. It gave the campaign along the zone a convenient dividing line to measure progress against. On that ground, the names went on changing faster than the ground did. The Marines counted what they could count. Their own dead and wounded were counted exactly, name by name, and the numbers in the records are the numbers. The other side was counted differently. After one July fight, the official history says plainly that the battalion established no accurate count of enemy killed. On another day, men trying to arrive at a figure counted canteens. Because canteens could be counted, and the whole northern half of the arithmetic lay across a river no one on the ground was allowed to cross, weather took its share as well. Of the first weeks of September, the Army's history notes that actual enemy casualties were hard to estimate, because fog and cloud and rain made aerial observation difficult. The same history, discussing the practice in general terms, says that a figure arrived at by walking over ground afterward represented more of an educated guess than a precise tabulation. That men in a fight had neither the time nor the inclination to make detailed counts, and that the other side carried its own away whenever it could. The histories are open about where they come from. They were built out of monthly command chronicles, after-action reports, message files, the daily journals that units kept, and a collection of oral history. More than 250 reviewers, most of them men who had been in the places described, read the manuscript before it was printed. All of it is one side's paper. The men across the river kept records of their own, and we do not have them. What the Marines who served up there called the duty was turn in the barrel. The official history's own summary of the place is a single sentence. The Thien area remained a grim place, and it lists the reasons. The standing risk of artillery, rocket and mortar fire, the massed infantry attacks, the drizzle and the mud there was no getting away from. It records as well, without enlarging on it, that neuropsychiatric casualties, relatively unheard of elsewhere in South Vietnam, were not uncommon there. Whether the hill was worth what it took is a question the record argues with itself about, and all the arguing is inside one service's history of itself. The case for holding it never changed and never needed restating. It was the highest ground for miles, and a man standing on it could see. Lose it, the official history says, and the way would be open into Quang Tri province for the North Vietnamese force that had gathered north of the zone. That, and a victory of very large propaganda value on top of it. The case against was not about the hill. The general who took over the division in November said that the barrier project had influenced almost everything they did, and that the chain of consequences was simple. The division was responsible for the barrier, and if it was responsible for the barrier, then it had to have Camp Carroll, and it had to have Khe Lu, and it had to have Con Thien, and it had to have Khe Sanh. It had a great deal to do, he said, with the 3rd Division being tied to static posts. The colonel commanding the 9th Marine said much the same in fewer words, that up there they were sitting in defensive positions, playing strictly defensive combat, when Marines were supposed to be coming in over a beach. The men who held the hill and the men who argued about the line were often the same men, and both of those judgments are printed in the same service's own history, written afterward by people who had been on that ground. The record sets them side by side and leaves them there. Neither of them is a verdict on the war, and the histories do not offer one. The commander of American forces in Vietnam kept a judgment of his own, and it was his own. At the end of September, he noted that the fundamental problem was that the American posture south of the zone was defensive, and that around Con Thien it was relatively static. When the shelling fell away in October, he put it down to 3 North Vietnamese regiments going back north to sit out the rainy season. He also found that holding the north of I Corps was costing him 2 divisions, and possibly 3, something near a third of his strength in the country. The widest ledger of all is the year. Forces under the Marine Command in 1st Corps reported 25,452 enemy dead for 1967, and another 23,000 as probable. By comparison, says the same passage, over 3,600 Americans died in 1st Corps during the same period. These are the numbers for the whole of 1st Corps. 5 provinces in a year, not for one hill. What the record holds exactly, and by name, is its own. Every American killed on that ground in that year is written down somewhere with his name and his unit and the date, and those pages are not estimates. Everything else in this arithmetic is a figure somebody arrived at with the tools he had. A walk across ground, a count of canteens, a look down through cloud at a place he was not allowed to visit. The hill itself never appeared in any column. It went on being a low red rise in a red plain, and the one thing about it that no ledger ever touched was its name, somewhere in the middle of the Marine Corps' official history of that year. In a passage about artillery and the weight of it, there is a sentence that stops for a moment and then moves on. It says that the hill was known to local missionaries as the Hill of Angels. That is all it says. It does not say who first used the name, or when, or what it was meant to mean. It does not say whether the people who farmed that plain used it, or whether it was only ever a word in somebody's letters home. It gives the name the way you might write down something you had heard once and did not want to lose. And then it goes back to the shelling and it never mentions the name again. So we are left with a plain fact and nothing underneath it. Before it was a strong point, before it was a target, before it was a place where young men learned how deep to dig, the hill already had a name, and the name was not about any of that. The rest of the record thins out the way a road thins out. In the autumn of that year, Thien held a reinforced battalion, and the ground around it held 2 more. A year later, in December of 1968, the same hill and 2 neighboring positions, 3 places that had each been the work of a whole battalion, were the responsibility of 2 companies. Thien itself was covered by one of them. Nobody wrote about that. It was not a decision anybody announced. It was simply what the war needed by then, and the paperwork recorded it in a line about boundaries. And then, for more than 3 years, the name almost disappears from the papers we have. When it comes back once, in a single line, in the spring of 1972. At 10:45 in the morning on the 1st of April, Thien was evacuated. Later the same afternoon, 3 fire support bases south and west of it were given up as well. That is the last time the hill appears. There is no account of the walk down, no list of who was last through the wire. No note of the weather. The record simply stops using the word. The line the hill had been built to anchor was never finished. The bunkers on Thien itself were completed in March of 1968, weeks after anyone was still counting on the rest of it. And after that, the record loses interest in the line the way it loses interest in the hill. If you had walked the hill in the last week of that year, you would have found what the photographs found: mud and wire, and positions built out of sandbags and ammunition boxes, and supplies stacked wherever there was room for them. Somewhere in the middle of it, a young Marine standing radio watch as the year came to an end. He is not named in the caption. He is doing the least dramatic thing a man can do in a war, sitting near a radio, awake, while nothing happens. That is the whole of it, really. A low hill and a red plain, a line drawn on a map in an office 5,000 miles away, and a strip of ground cut across the country to make it real. A spring of night attacks, a summer of sandbags and 5 or 6 shells a day, one hard morning on a cart track between 2 hedgerows, and a month in the autumn when the sky over that hill was never quiet for long. Then rain, and more rain, and a road that had to be rebuilt before anything could move along it at all. Guns on the far side of a river, firing from a place no one could walk to, and men going down into the ground and coming back up, and going down again, for a year. The plain out there is still red. Laterite is clay and iron does not stop being red. Somewhere under all of it, under the wire and the bunkers and the arithmetic, under the reports and the counts that never quite agreed, there was a hill, and it had a name, and the name had nothing to do with the war at all. Sleep well.